Welcome to Decoding Healthcare Research. I'm your host, Efrain Riveros, Dr. E.F. Rain. Today we will tackle one important topic, that is opioid addiction. And we have the honor of having with us Dr. George Koob. He is the director of the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. And we will be discussing one of his papers published in the journal Biological Psychiatry in 2020. The title of the paper is Neurobiology of Opioid Addiction, Opponent Process, Hyperkatifeia, and Negative Reinforcement. Welcome to our podcast, Dr. Koob.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much. So it's not a secret that that opioid addiction is something that is becoming more prevalent in our society for different reasons that we are not going to discuss here. But the impact on public health and the effect on society at large is significant. So in this podcast, we are trying to understand better the different aspects of human health. And one of them is, what are the mechanisms? What is going on when someone gets into a process of addiction to opioids? So I guess my first question to Dr. Koob today is, for how long have you been doing research in this particular topic?
I did my first basic research paper on heroin in 1973. So I think that's close to 50 years. And I should emphasize to you that I'm a senior scientist in the National Institute on Drug Abuse, where I have a basic research laboratory. So it's been over 50 years that I've been working with opioids.
Yeah, and I guess that you have been seeing the evolution of the topic and the effect on society, and I want to focus our discussion on opioid addiction, starting from the stages that you describe in your paper. So there are different stages that the person goes through, from the very moment of the acute intoxication into what becomes a real addiction. So can you tell us a little bit more about those three stages that you described?
Yes, and they're generic to all addictions, but probably most of our thinking came from work on alcohol and opioids over the years. Actually, the three-stage cycle of addiction came from my teaching a course on self-regulation at the University of California, San Diego, before I joined the NIH, and that was somewhere around 1987. So it's been a long time since we conceptualized these three stages. So the three stages are the binge intoxication stage, the withdrawal negative affect stage, and the preoccupation anticipation stage, or the craving stage. In fact, these now we know represent three domains of dysfunction. So for the binge intoxication phase, there's increased reward, increased incentive salience. And incentive salience is a big word to reflect the fact that stimuli in the environment compared with the drug and ultimately elicit a craving or a drive for the drug, or a motivation to get the drug. So a green Starbucks sign is a perfect example of incentive salience. You see a green Starbucks sign, and now you want a Starbucks coffee. Okay, and that's normal life. Incentive salience is part of normal life. But with drugs of addiction, it's much more exacerbated. Then the withdrawal negative affect stage is basically deficits in reward, going in the opposite direction, and increased stress. And and basically it's misery, right? And I'll probably repeat that a couple times. And then preoccupation anticipation stage is when you may stop taking the drug, but now you have this enormous urge to reinstate taking the drug. But there's also cognitive dysfunction there. So your frontal cortex impulsivity system doesn't work very well. So, and then the three stages are represented by three general brain circuits. It's going to be hard for a lay audience, but the basal ganglia are involved in motivation and drive much of what goes on in the binge intoxication stage. And that's part of our brain that's deep in the frontal lobe part that gets us going and moving toward stimuli in the environment. The withdrawal negative affect stage, the circuit is focused on the amygdala, the fight or flight system, and deep in your temporal lobe. And the preoccupation anticipation stage is largely localized to frontal cortex, the part of our brain that is, in some sense, our superego, that controls our impulses, that controls our reptile brain. And so, you know, the addiction cycle, most people think of it as starting with binge intoxication, going through withdrawal negative affect, and going to preoccupation anticipation. But actually, the way we think about it, you can enter in any different one of the stages. And what the opioid crisis has really emphasized is that you can enter through the withdrawal negative affect stage. And so when oxycodone became readily available and it was overprescribed for many pain conditions, that opened the door to addiction in you know, millions of individuals, in fact. And that was the beginning of the opioid crisis. So you can also enter, obviously, the binge intoxication stage, and that's when you start taking drugs, maybe recreationally with friends, or you can enter through the preoccupation anticipation stage. Think of individuals with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder who may start using stimulants, you know, in a sense, to self-medicate their impulsivity. So, you know, it's a heuristic framework. That's a big word to say that it's testable hypothesis. And now the three stages have been, in fact, validated by at least close to a dozen studies of humans and using factor analysis. So these are the three major components of the addiction cycle.
And it's interesting how this cycle is self-perpetuating, and I feel that the negative emotional stage, it becomes central in that perpetuation of the cycle, right? So you mentioned that there is a dysregulation in this emotional state, and you basically depict a parallel between physical pain and that emotional state. And in that particular area, even though opioid addiction is not my area of expertise, but the fact that I am an anesthesiologist, I have seen the physiological effects of hyperalgesia when the patient is exposed to an opioid, being remifentanil probably the one where you can see it in the briefest short term. And it's something that is real, and you actually see the physiological effects. So my question is, can you describe better that parallel between physical pain and this emotional state?
Yeah, so, and in fact, what you just described is what prompted me to make up a word. So back in 2010 with two anesthesiologists, Joe Sherman and Howard Gutstein, we wrote a paper about pain and the crossover with emotional pain. And we introduced the word hyperkatifeia, which is simply the Greek for sadness, dejection, misery, katifeia. And I put hyper in front of it because, as you point out, hyperalgesia is a hypersensitivity to pain. Hyperkatifeia is a hypersensitivity to the negative emotional parts of addiction. And, you know, it's basically a misery factor. So all kinds of contributors to hyperkatifeia in the form of symptoms. It can be anxiety, it can be depression-like symptoms, it can be sleep disturbances, as you mentioned, it could be irritability. It could be a kind of mild dysphoria. Often individuals with alcohol use disorder describe not feeling normal within their own skin, and you can have some of these symptoms from other ways. We'll probably talk about that a little later. But one of the major important parts about addiction is that inevitably addiction leads to hyperkatifeia, because when the drug is stopped, all the things that you've been self-medicating in the domain of negative emotions come back with a vengeance. And so you're absolutely right. The cycle illustrates the point that it gets worse and worse over time. In fact, I always like to tell the story that when with Michel Lemoyle, when we first published in Science the cycle of addiction, it was a spiral. I went to the Society for Neuroscience meeting and someone had mounted my spiral on a toilet. And so we got rid of the spiral and kept the circle. But in effect, the cartoon that this young graduate student had, a postdoctoral fellow had illustrated, is true. It is, in a sense, a spiral where it gets worse over time. And you keep digging a hole in your emotional circuits. And I'll explain more of that later. I'll stop right now for.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And one of the aspects that caught my attention is that you are centering in this paper on the negative emotional stage. And I guess my question is, in terms of neurocircuitry, where do hyperalgesia and hyperkatifeia intersect?
Well, they intersect in an area of the brain deep in your temporal lobe that's called the amygdala. And in fact, there is what one of my favorite researchers in the pain field, Volker Neugebauer, calls the nociceptive amygdala. And that's actually a part of the lateral part of the central nucleus of the amygdala. The central nucleus of the amygdala has long been known to have a key role in fear, conditioned fear, fight or flight. It is, in a sense, the part of the circuitry that, when you step out onto to cross the street in a major city in the United States and you don't look to notice whether the lights changed and a taxi comes bearing down on you, you have two choices. Either freeze or you run across the street. But one of the things you'll notice is that after that has occurred, even though you might have been a little sleepy and tired, suddenly you're full of energy. If you have a head cold, your nasal passages have cleared. You'll notice that your heart is pounding, and so that's a sympathetic fight or flight response. And so that's what our amygdala does for us. It signals, hey, get the heck out of there or freeze. And that system is what, in effect, overlaps with the pain system to be modulate the affective components of pain. And there's actually, the famous pain circuit that you learned in medical school is the spinal thalamic system. It goes up and, hits the thalamus and then rattles around in the somatosensory cortex and eventually gets down to the amygdala. But there's another pain pathway that was identified by a French professor named Besson and Donald Price at Hopkins, that they called the emotional pain system. And that comes up directly from the spinal cord to the parabrachial nucleus, directly into the amygdala. And that amygdala projects back to the periaqueductal gray, which is, as you know, is another place where pain is modulated and plenty of opioid receptors and so forth. And so this pain circuit interfaces with the hyperkatifeia circuit in the amygdala. That's a simple version of the story. That's where the wires get crossed. And so physical pain can cause emotional pain, and emotional pain can cause physical pain. We used to call that psychosomatic disturbances, but they're real, okay? And so, if you're in chronic physical pain, you're going to have emotional pain that goes with that. And if you're in chronic emotional pain, you're gonna start to have physical pain that goes with it. So all of these overlap in this key part of our brain that we need for fight or flight.
So could we say that after, say, an acute intoxication with opioid or any other substance for that matter, there is like an initial compensatory like mechanism that becomes maladaptive, and then you enter the cycle of addiction? Is that a good appreciation?
Absolutely. We call this opponent process. It was put forward in the early 80s by Richard Solomon at the University of Pennsylvania. But another way of looking at it is, from my perspective, and when I would teach undergraduate students at the University of California, is there's no free ride in the brain. There's no free ride in the brain. You pay for everything. So if you take a drug that elevates you in a positive hedonic way, when the drug wears off, there's going to be a negative hedonic rebound because the brain reacts to whatever challenge it gets. It goes the other way too, of course. If you think of skydiving, Richard Solomon talked about that. So if you actually jump out of an airplane, which I'm not going to do and have never done, but if you were to jump out of an airplane and the parachute opens, then there's this huge relief of fear, which is positive. And that's because your brain has reacted to the stress. So, you know, Solomon had it right. What we've been doing since Richard Solomon hypothesized this is trying to understand what are the neurocircuits and elements that contribute to this opponent process. And it's a hedonic opponent process.
Yeah, and I think it's that leads me to the next question. So when we talk about this emotional state that you allude to, you mentioned like for the formation of any habit, you need a cue and a context. So how does it happen that how does the brain react? What is the cue? What is the context so that you can remain in the loop of addiction?
Well, there are two cues and two contexts. The main context is, in fact, a low-level hyperkatifeia. So the most relapses occur in addiction in negative emotional states. And that goes back to the early work of Alan Marlatt. But, you know, it's like 70% of relapses occur in some form of negative emotional state. But the cues in the environment can be linked to the pleasurable effects of the drug, or with opiates, they can be linked to the aversive effects of withdrawal. And both can contribute to relapse. And so it depends, in some sense, it's going to be timing. So, you know, I mean, Charles O'Brien at the University of Pennsylvania for years described, you know, someone who, you know, flew to California, had been detoxified from opioids, flew to California, had methadone in the suitcase back in the day when you could carry a liquid in your suitcase, and never took it when he was in California. But when he returned to Philadelphia, got off at his regular subway stop, he suddenly was overwhelmed with feelings of conditioned withdrawal and had to take his methadone. And of course, you know, the works, you know, needles and white powder also are powerful cues for reinstatement of drug seeking. And sometimes they give you a slight buzz, you know, a positive hedonic response initially. And there are plenty of data on that in the literature, the old literature, where they would substitute saline in a syringe and the person would actually get a little high from the saline injection, from the vehicle injection. But that dissipates quickly, and then you can get the conditioned withdrawal as well. So there's a double whammy in the stimuli that are paired with drugs. They can be paired with the drug or they can be paired with the withdrawal. But the negative emotional state is underlying both as a motivational factor. And that's been not really well understood, in my opinion, until recently. I mean, I think the COVID pandemic has really shown a light on that part. And that gets into allostasis, allostatic load, and other environmental contributors.
So allostasis understood as a like an adaptive response to try to restore homeostasis?
Right, but it's called stability with change. So basically, the idea is, and this was put forth by Dr. Sterling and Dr. Iyer quite some time ago, and they were mostly focused on stress and the stress of society and the environment. And then Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University introduced the term allostatic load. So allostasis was the process, as you say, of trying to get back to homeostasis, but you never quite made it back to homeostasis. So let's talk about it in hedonic form. So we've already said there's an opponent process. So, you know, part of this picture with drugs is tolerance, or what we say in gambling is chasing. This happens dramatically with alcohol. You can start drinking at the beginning of an evening, and that first drink just wipes out all those negative memories, all the negative emotional states. You just feel this wave of relief coming over you. So you want to perpetuate that. So you have another drink, but the second drink doesn't have anywhere near the powerful effect as the first drink. And the third drink and the fourth drink, and you end up drinking, you don't even know why you're drinking. And it's more or less the same for all drugs of addiction. In gambling, we call it chasing a loss. In addiction, we call it tolerance. So you are no longer getting the same effect of the drug. And that is basically the beginning of allostasis, because you're trying to fix the problem by taking the drug, which is making the problem worse. But you're stable. You know, I mean, you're not really maybe crashed and burned. You may not have even fully entered the addiction cycle, and you're stable for a while. So the allostasis process creates a load on the system, and Bruce McEwen called this an allostatic load. But allostatic loads can also be, you know, you were abused as a child, and those brain circuits are sensitized in your amygdala for a stress response. Allostatic load can be, you know, environmental stressors that you're currently undergoing, and the only relief you see is by taking an opioid, because everything is negative. You know, you lost your job, maybe you're in a great deal of pain, and in fact, this did happen to trigger the opioid crisis in places like Eastern Kentucky in the United States, where there was a massive job loss in the mining community. These were individuals who had suffered significant physical pain from the job that they had. And then oxycodone arrives, and everybody starts taking it to relieve the pain and the misery. But it backfires on you, because when it wears off, the pain and misery come back with a vengeance. And that is allostasis, as we call it in the addiction field. So you've reached a state of a break with homeostasis, and you try defending it, but eventually it just keeps getting worse and worse, and ultimately you end up in a full-blown addiction cycle. And so that's the allostatic perspective. But we try to defend our hedonic state. We try to keep it in the normal range, but we misregulate that by taking drugs to try and keep it in the normal range. And that's when treatment is needed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you mentioned as well that there are differences between the sexes, between male and female. What are those differences in terms of addiction?
So I know more about the alcohol effects than I know about the opioid effects, but I suspect that some of these are parallel with opioids. So one of the things we know is that women are more sensitive to the same amount of alcohol, largely because of body water distribution. So they will get a lot higher blood alcohol level for the same amount of alcohol. They're also smaller. So if they try to keep up with men in drinking, they're going to end up more intoxicated. But more insidious for women is that they're more susceptible to entering the addiction cycle, to liver disease, to some of the emotional effects of drugs, the negative emotional effects, to depression and anxiety like responses. And I suspect that also occurs for opioids. I'm not as up to date on the male-female difference with opioids, but I know there's, again, evidence suggesting that women are more vulnerable to entering the addiction cycle and moving faster into the pathology of the cycle.
One other thing that I wanted to ask you is this.
And
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
One other point. I'm sorry, is that women in general have much higher levels of anxiety and depression-like disorders in the population, and there's high comorbidity with depression and anxiety with opiate addiction and with alcohol addiction.
Yeah, they are at a disadvantage, if you will, in that regard. Yeah, I was now thinking. So it's the framework in itself is very interesting because it explains the different phases of the cycle and how it becomes self-perpetuating. Focusing specifically on the negative emotional state and understanding this concept, how can this concept be applied as a lever to go into treatment? How can understanding of this help in treatment?
Well, our argument, and we've developed a framework for this we call the addiction neuroclinical assessment, is that everyone takes drugs for different reasons. And many people do take drugs, particularly opioids, to relieve pain. And sometimes they're taking opioids to relieve the pain. Many times they're taking opioids to relieve the pain that the opioids caused in the first place. The hyperalgesia, like you're talking about, the hyperkatifeia, like we've been talking about. I think we need to focus more on relieving the misery that's associated with addiction and less on blocking the reward associated with addiction. And I think this concept has started to filter through. But there are young people, for example, who are probably just taking drugs recreationally, getting into trouble with them, might even meet the criterion for an alcohol use disorder, an opioid use disorder, but who ultimately may fully recover and may benefit from blocking the reward system. So, with naltrexone, which blocks opiate reward and blocks alcohol reward. So there are individual differences. And one of the things we're doing with the addiction neuroclinical assessment is trying to find ways with an algorithm of a combination of self-report, a combination of neuropsychological tests, ultimately maybe even some surrogate for imaging. It could be EEG or low potentials that will predict this is a person who's entered the addiction cycle from the incentive salience perspective, or this is a person who entered because of pain or because of hyperkatifeia, or this is a person who just has a very severe impulsivity problem. And so they're taking drugs to try and control their impulsivity. And I think it's going to, in the future, shape how treatment is done and make it more individualized. We need more treatments. There are behavioral treatments that work on the withdrawal negative affect stage. Cognitive behavioral therapy is an excellent example. In contrast, motivational interviewing might be better for those individuals, young people who suddenly discover that they're spending so much money on alcohol. And if they stop spending a lot of money on alcohol, they could buy a new car, or they could get a better apartment. And that's a, kind of part of motivational interviewing. So even the behavioral treatments can be shaped. Mindfulness is another example with cognitive behavioral therapy, can be shaped to fit how you enter the addiction cycle. And I've been urging for some time that more emphasis be put on the withdrawal negative affect stage, and in particular the hyperkatifeia-like symptoms that are associated with it.
Yeah, and it's very, very interesting because as you say, not all addictions and not all situations are created equal, and they need to be approached individually. And understanding this framework is definitely helpful. And I want to close by yeah, please go ahead.
Two other quick points on this, really quick. So another benefit of the hyperkatifeia approach is that there's what we call protracted, I made up this word last spring, protracted hyperkatifeia. So this low-level negative emotional state can always be there, even a year later. Even pain responses or hypersensitivity to pain are still responsive, still there in opiate, in individuals with opiate addiction a year later. So, you know, it changes the other part is that it emphasizes that this is a brain disorder and the brain has changed and you need to reverse that change. And all of this takes time. So 28-day rehab is wonderful because it gets people off drugs, but it's not a treatment for addiction per se. You have to buy into the long-term, what I call community reinforcement approach that involves all kinds of other factors. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thank you actually for that intervention, because it my perception is that the complexity of the problem requires also a complex solution, and it involves tackling the problem from different fronts, and having a common framework that makes sense like this one is definitely part of the treatment. I was saying that I'm very grateful for having had this opportunity to talk with you, and I appreciate that you are sharing your wisdom with us, and to make it clear, because I think this message needs to be spread. I think that the way addictions are understood is going to contribute a lot to the solution to the problem. And if this information comes from the expert, this is really useful from the societal standpoint. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ephraim. Great questions and really nice discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So for our audience, you are going to find the link to the paper that we discussed today in the description of the video. And don't forget to leave us your feedback. See you in the next episode.